Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Welcome, everyone, to Clear Mountain's weekly Wednesday live stream. We'll be here on YouTube for about 45 minutes and then gather on Zoom. Let me know if the audio and the visual is okay. So today, I wanted to have some fun and go into a topic which we generally steer away from in terms of talking about too explicitly, and that's rebirth. Just because it's a topic which is controversial and which many people find it difficult to really believe or find off-putting. And this was the case in the Buddha's time as well. There were many views. The view that the consciousness cease at death was called Uchedavada, the teaching of cutting off, and a sort of dry materialism. And in the Kalama Sutta, which is a sutta I think many of you might be familiar with, the Buddha basically lays out what he calls the double bet. So the Kalamas are in doubt around the truth of different elements that they've been hearing about from various teachers. And the Buddha says, look, if there's another life, then behave well, do good, and the rebirth will be happy. If there's not another life, then behave well, do good, and you'll be praised by the wise and have a good life here and now. So it's a double bet. It's good whether or not there's another life. It's a pragmatic approach. And this often is the route we take in talking about things here in the West, where many people find this difficult to believe, because we don't want to turn anyone off. And yet it's a important teaching. And so first, many teachers, such as Ajahn Nisabho, will recommend just taking it on as a working hypothesis and see how it affects your behavior. What happens if you act as if rebirth is real? And how does that affect the way you hold ethics, the way you hold the moment, the way you hold tragedy, the way you hold the path? But I think more than that, or rather, we can step a bit further today and just invite a few minutes of actually looking a little deeper into this. Ajahn Saro makes the analogy, or gives the analogy, of a map. And he says, as you encounter the Buddha's teachings and explore them, you find time and again there's this truth that shines through. The Buddha's genius shows again and again. And it's as if you have a map, and at first you don't know if the map is correct, but as you follow it, you find time and again the landmarks on the map align with the landmarks you're seeing around you. But on the distant edge of the map, there's a range of tall mountains, and you've never seen mountains before. So do you just dismiss the mountains because you've never seen anything like them as fictitious? Or is there a place for, over time, as you build confidence in this map maker, for acknowledging maybe there is something I haven't seen yet, and maybe the mountains do exist, and that faith in the map translating to an openness to what might exist on the edges? Similarly, as we gain faith, confidence in the Buddha's teachings through verifying it day to day through seeing his spiritual genius shine through the pages of the suttas? Can we make space in our minds for just acknowledging that maybe there are things we don't quite know, and that the map maker, the teacher, the Buddha, seems to have gotten a lot right, and maybe there's something else going on? I would say that many of us approach this question at first with a pretty agnostic touch. It's not necessary at the beginning of practice. It's true. You can meditate in the heart of the Buddhist path. Cultivation of the mind and heart does not require belief in rebirth. But I think after practicing for a time, it's important for us to at least look into it a little bit, to take the Buddha's words seriously. That's what we commit to doing as Buddhists, not believing everything he says, but at least taking him seriously. And enough to look into things. Because the question of rebirth genuinely affects our existential situation. It's a real question, and it's a big, the answer does affect our behavior. And there can be a conceit that, whether or not I believe in this, or, it won't affect how I act at all. I would say, from having lived on both sides of that divide and not believed in rebirth and then believed in rebirth, and meeting many who have, it does make a difference. It's hard to justify going forth as a monastic if you don't have that belief. It's possible, but it's hard. And the Buddha explicitly referenced it as an element of right view. There is this world and the other world, and so on. He also, of the three knowledges in the night of his enlightenment, the Te-Vijja, as they're called, the first was about rebirth and seeing his past lives. The second was about karma, seeing the lives of all beings kind of swirling around samsara. And the third was liberation. So it's foundational, and it's all through the suttas. So I think for me, I grew up in this culture and didn't believe in such things. And there came a point in high school where there'd been so many people in my life who'd experienced strange things I couldn't explain, and they couldn't either. And every time I heard one of those stories or read a study that seemed a bit strange, perhaps indicating some sort of supernatural thing, there'd just be this quick dismissal of like fake science, or, who knows, probably confirmation bias. And there really came a point where I said, like, these people are people I trust. I know they're sane, reasonable. If this was any other subject, I would at least be open to it. So can I put down my disbelief for a while? And I did. And when I did that, what I found is and began talking to people close to me, so many had really clear experiences which were pretty difficult to explain. One, to just throw it out there, was my parents were on a ski trip, and someone close to them was sick, and on the ski slope, either my mom looked at my dad or my dad looked at my mom and just said, "I think she's dead." And she died exactly that hour. And you could, perhaps it's coincidence, but that's quite a coincidence. And I think most of us have, encountered similar situations somewhere in there. So I think just there can be a disbelief which is dogmatic. And I think making room in our hearts, at least to look into it a little bit. That's all. As to things lining up with science, I think it's important to realize that what science is experts form the edge of a lens through which we see the world. Many of us have never seen subatomic particles or interstellar nebula. Maybe we've seen pictures, but we have experts in our society who have such tools and have seen them. And when enough independently verify phenomena, we consider it scientifically verified. the issue with all, this sort of other realm stuff is the technology, which is samadhi, concentration, the powerful mind, has been lost for many years in the West, many millennia. And yet when people stumble on it sporadically, but you enter a culture such as those that exist in Asia, where there's been large institutions and many teachers with very powerful samadhi, and they are all independently verifying something quite similar over the ages. And that's the fact that perhaps this body's end isn't the end of awareness. And similarly to how you might trust someone, even though you don't have a microscope, I think a case can be made for looking at those experts with that technology of the mind as the edge of this lens through which we might see this other realm of the world. The other scientific piece of evidence, which I think is most useful to look into, and it's what finally really convinced me, was a body of work by Dr. Ian Stevenson in the University of Virginia. And starting in about 1960, he began looking into the reports of past life memories from children, usually 2 to 5 years old, and verifying them and recording details, and then going and tracking down the families or individuals who they reported memories of, and independently verifying the facts. And he and his staff, and they're still doing it, worked, I think, with nearly 3,000 cases. And he was followed by many journalists. Let's see. I have something about this. Basically, by the time the Journal of the American Medical Association referred to Stevenson's cases of reincarnation as painstaking and unemotional. The Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease devoted most of one of its issues to his research. And writing in the journal, the psychiatrist Harold Leaf described Stevenson as a methodical investigator and added, either he is making a colossal mistake or he will be known as the Galileo of the 20th century. And so the books that were written about him, and there's a few, I've posted some into the description, including Before the Past Lives of Children, are really impactful to read. And I'd say it's just to put out an invitation there to spend some time reading one of them or looking into one of them, because they're pretty fascinating, and it's what really turned my mind in the end. The final question to address is the classic one of what gets reborn if there's no self in Buddhism. And I think Ajahn Nisabho's recollection of or description of this is helpful, where he says that's looking at it backwards. That's looking at as the self as carrying on karma, or rather karma in the context of self. But rather in Buddhism, the self happens in the context of karma. Namely, we have a continuity of habit, of craving. And one of those habit patterns is the creation of a sense of self. And as to what that substrate of karma is, of continuity, which flows or lights from life to life, who knows? There's a decent argument to be made via or from experiments with quantum states that the observer has a real effect on reality in quantum fields, that basically consciousness is a primary element. This is gaining some ground in the scientific communities these days under the question of the hard problem of consciousness, and resulting in different theories such as panpsychism. And also, I just question our sort of idea of this little homunculus jumping from body to body. When you have a dream and then you have another dream, you don't ask what goes from dream to dream. The dreams just happen. And so these are all minor issues. And what I wanted to do, though, was go into a few of these cases because they're really fun. And I think it would be worth going into. So let's try it. Basically, the Division of Perceptual Studies, which is the faculty in the University of Virginia that Dr. Ian Stevenson worked with. And I've pasted a link to an hour-long YouTube video interview with them, with John Cleese, actually, in the description of the YouTube. It's really fun. I recommend watching it. It has 3 million views. But they basically did quite a lot of studies on these past life memories. And I want to, mention these aren't anecdotal. This isn't anecdotal evidence. This is an anecdote and facts given by a individual, a child, and then verified independently. And in the absence of some way of transmitting that information, it goes beyond just the anecdotal. But they found that the average interval between death and a previous person's birth, or between a previous death and the new birth, was about 4.5 years, but the median interval was just 16 months. And 70% of them talked about death from an unnatural cause, the idea being that often a traumatic death led to the memory popping up in the new life. So one of my favorites is the story of James Leniger. So he was a kid who, his parents were a Christian couple in Louisiana. I'm reading this off the screen. His father particularly was opposed to the idea of rebirth. When James began to have nightmares where he would scream, kick his feet in the air, and yell, airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out. During the day, he would slam model airplanes against the table and yell, airplane crash on fire. The parents have a picture of the table with dents. After his second birthday, the parents were able to have a conversation where he said he'd been shot down by the Japanese, and that he'd flown a Corsair, which was a type of plane used in World War II. When his parents asked which boat he'd been on, he said the Natoma. The USS Natoma Bay was an aircraft carrier escort station in the Pacific in World War II. His parents asked him who he was, and he would always say, me or James. And they asked who else was there, to which he would reply, Jack Larson. When he was 2.5, his dad bought a book on Iwo Jima, which was a battle, for James's grandfather's birthday. When they were flipping through the book, there was a picture of Iwo Jima, and James pointed to it and said that was where his plane was shot down, which floored his dad. He then learned that the Natoma Bay did in fact take part in the Iwo Jima operation. He also learned there was only one pilot from that ship who had died during the Iwo Jima mission, a 20-year-old from Pennsylvania named James Houston, and his plane crashed in exactly the way James had described. James had said his plane had been shot down in the engine, caught on fire, crashed in the ocean, and that's exactly what had happened to James Houston's plane. The pilot in the plane next to James' plane on the day that he was killed was named Jack Larson, which is the name he'd reported. There's another one I think is fun to go into, so let's do it. This is the case of Malik from 1997. He was born in Adana, Turkey, in 1951. When he became able to speak relatively late, he began to insist that his name was really Nekip, an insistence before which his parents eventually gave way, and that he had lived in Mersin, about 80 kilometers away. He made a number of statements about his supposed previous life, but not until 1963 was it discovered, through a fortuitous meeting, that they coincided closely with the life of a man named Nekik Budak, who had lived in Mersin and been murdered there in 1951. Ian Stevenson and a Turkish associate recorded 14 of these statements in 1963. 11 were correct, 1 partially correct, 1 unverified, and 1 incorrect. Among the correct statements were the 4 names of his Mersin wife, mother, and 1 of his sons, that he was stabbed to death and had been very drunk at the time, and that also, when drunk, he had stabbed his wife in the leg. The latter was confirmed by the lady herself, who showed the scar on her thigh to a female member of Stevenson's party. After the two families had met in 1963, 12 correct recognitions by Nekip of persons whom Nekip Budak had known, or of possessions he had owned, were confirmed by the Budak family. Both families denied any previous knowledge of the other, and Stephen could not discover any plausible source of transmission of the information from one family to the other. At birth, Neckett had had 7 birthmarks, of which 3 were still visible when Stevenson examined him. 6 of these corresponded in position with the knife wounds recorded in Neckett Budak's autopsy report. All right. I want to answer some questions, but I really love these stories. So let's do at least this one, because I think this one leads into an interesting tangent. This is Dhammaruan, and many of you will know Dhammaruan's story. He was born November 18th, 1968 in Mattal in Sri Lanka. At an age of about 2 years, he would sit in meditation spontaneously and then start chanting, as well as, at times, saying things in a language not understood by his mother, who tried to hush him up. This feature of the present case is similar to the Burmese children who remember previous lives as Japanese soldiers, and who apparently spoke for some time in early childhood in a language not understood by their families. It also bears similarity to the case of the Thai child who, at the age of 2, presumably as a result of remembering a former life, spent for a considerable time living in a monastery, spontaneously sat in meditation. Another parallel obtains with the case of the Indian girl who was able to perform dances and sing in Bengali, a language unknown to her family. So Dhammaruan began to chant spontaneously Buddhist chants in a melodious way, which his parents had never heard, and it was flawless. Some of the chants include the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the first discourse, and others. And Bhante Analayo, many of you will know him, lived near Dhammaruan when he was an adult. And Dr. Ian Stevenson was one of the many, including several monks, who went to meet Dhammaruan as a young boy. And his father took recordings of his chants. So Bhante Analayo wrote a book recently called Rebirth. And what he does in it, in classic Analayo fashion, which involves sort of half a page of text and then half a page of footnotes, he's meticulous, is he takes these recordings of these chants and he analyzes every syllable, and then he matches those syllables to the extant versions of those same chants in Sri Lanka, and also to the preserved text of those chants in other traditions in distant areas, such as Kashmir in Sri Lanka, or Kashmir in northern India. And what he finds through this careful analysis, and he lays it out in this painstaking tables, is that the places where Dhammaruans, there's a few syllables where they diverge from the way that it's chanted in Sri Lanka. But the places where it diverges actually match with extant versions in these other traditions, such as Kashmir. And basically it's a proof that the flukes or the divergent syllables can't have been accidental, and neither could they have been, trained into him. These other versions of the chants from which these syllabic changes were also recorded in were far away and not chanted, but they attested to a common way of chanting, a common text, which was extant at the time of Dhammaruan's former birth, which he said to be 5th century AD, around 5th century AD, as one of Buddhaghosa's, the famous commentator in Sri Lanka, his attendant. So basically, Bhante Analayo is famous for these comparative studies where he looks at different texts and then finding the commonalities between them, he traces them back to a source text and then shows how they've all diverged. And that was what he did here, is basically showed that even though Dhammaruan's chant didn't match any current text now available, it did match what would have been the root text of all those. And it's half the book, his analysis. It's a stunning piece of evidence. And yet all of this can really seem like so much logic or dry logic. So I did want to play Damaruan's chanting for people, just so they might be able to listen. And this is a case of what they call xenoglossy, which is remembering a past language from a previous life. And people don't quite know how the memories travel, but some people do seem to keep them and then lose them over the years. I think after about 4 years old, people begin to lose the memory. So this is Damaruan chanting the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the turning of the wheel of Dhamma, the first discourse. And you can find it on YouTube if you want. And apart from just being beautiful, if it's true, then it shows you how they chanted in Sri Lanka 1500 years ago. So I always love that. The video is in the description. And yeah, if you want to, our Theravada chants are sometimes a little bit monotone. So if you want to spice it up, if you chant like that, that purportedly is how they chanted 1500 years ago at the time of Buddhaghosa. So let's, we can take some questions and people can write them in. But while we're waiting for that, and I know there's a few, I might just read one or two, maybe one more case study from Ian Stevenson, because I find them pretty wonderful, or interesting at the very least. Okay, so this is the story of Indika Ishvara. He was one of a pair of monogamous twins, or monozygous twins, born in Sri Lanka in October of 1972. The family lived in a village near the town of Weligama. At about the age of 3, Indika began relating ostensible memories of previous incarnations. His memories concerned the life of a boy from the village of Balapitiya, which he named, or he said the name of, about 45 kilometers away. Indika's father was sufficiently interested by his son's statements to ask a friend now living in Balapitiya to make inquiries there. This friend soon discovered a boy, Darshana Samasekera, who seemed to be unmistakably pinpointed by Indika's statements. Darshana had died at the age of 11, probably of viral encephalitis, in January of 1968. That's 4 years before Indika's birth. Darshana's father was very interested by Indika's statements, and in June of 1976, that was when Indika had been 4, he paid several visits to his home. The result was that a report of the case appeared in a newspaper towards the end of June. This in turn led a Sinhalese associate of Stevenson's, Dr. Ian Stevenson's, Godwin Samaratane, to visit both the families involved and collect statements. He also arranged to be present when Indika was taken in early July of 1976. So once again, that's when he's 4 years old, to visit Darshana's family for the first time. In December of 1978, and again in November of 1979, Stevenson, Samatarne, and another Sinhalese associate conducted extensive interviews with members of both the Ishvar and Samasakara families. Indika is recorded as having made 36 statements about his alleged previous life before the two families had met. So this is statements recorded before they had met. Of these, 31 were correct, 2 incorrect, 2 doubtful, and 1 unverified. Of the correct ones, some would have been applicable to many families in Sri Lanka, but others are quite specific. For instance, although he never gave the name Darshani, he said that he had been called Baby Mahataya, which is the name master or boss, that his older sister was named Malkanti, that he had an uncle named Premasiri, that he had an uncle on his father's side who was Mudali, a successful businessman, that he had an aunt who used to cook chilies for him, that the family's house was called Buon, and that he had left his foot, i.e., his footprint, in wet concrete there. When Indica was eventually taken to visit the Darshana family in 1976, July 4th, he seemed to have spontaneously recognized several family members. Stevenson, however, had reservations about those recognitions, and also non-recognitions, because of the distractions occasioned by considerable crowds of sensation seekers who had come there out of curiosity. But on Indica's second visit, early in 1977, he was observed wandering around outside a neighborhood house in the Samasakirs compound, apparently looking for something on the wall of a concrete drain. He then pointed to the words Darshana 1965 that had been scratched into the concrete before it had set. No one in Darshana's family knew about this writing. The two families had not met prior to June 1976 and lived a long way from each other. Stephen was unable to find any plausible lines of communication between them. Okay, so that's the as far as we'll go into this case studies. And to sort of wrap things up before questions, I just want to emphasize again, this is not an essential belief for practice. And I think for many who this doesn't land with, or who just read the evidence and find it unconvincing, that's completely all right. And the Buddha was, we can practice well one way or the other. And it is a central element of the Buddha's teachings that's not talked about often in the West. And so if monks don't occasionally speak to it, then who will? And I think just taking this as an invitation to look into it a little bit. And if you've gained a lot from this path, then maybe perhaps understanding acknowledging that the Buddha said this was something that was significant. And you get to read some fun stories. So in the description for the YouTube video, I've pasted a bunch of different links that you can look into, including a podcast, a video, and so on. People can type in questions if they want. Any comments, Ajahn, on what for an enlightened being moves on to the next life? The Buddha said craving is what moves on, just as like one burning house, the fire leaps to another. Kama also does. As to what material substrate that might be, or other substrate, I don't know. Either, as I said, there's arguments that consciousness is an element in reality, maybe. And also that whole paradigm is predicated on this idea of space and us as these little homunculi moving through it, and maybe that's an a priori assumption that's not valid. Maybe it is like being, once again, when you're dreaming, do you really wonder what travels from dream to dream, or do the dreams kind of happen? Oh, you answered my question. Okay, good. Does the Buddhist canon suggest a certain length of time between death and subsequent birth? Do we know when consciousness enters in the new body, in the womb? I don't think the Buddhist canon speaks about an exact time between births. There is debate around if there's an interim state or not. And in most Buddhist cultures, it's considered that there is an interim state between lives. And often, but I think that could be looked at as what the Buddhists would refer to as a preta, or a hungry ghost. So it's very interesting. In Thailand, if someone died from a traumatic accident where the people think that their ghost, their vijnana, their whatever, karma, might not have realized that it was dead and therefore might hang around. And there's general acknowledgement they sometimes hang around for 6 or 7 days after death. Then they won't burn the body. They'll bury the body. and leave it out for a time as well. And that's in the hopes that the confused spirit will stumble across their own body, realize they're dead, and then let go because they see the body. Whereas if they burn the body, then there's this belief that the spirit won't see the body and will continue to think it's alive and continue in this ghost state. So that's a nice, interesting little tidbit. As to exactly when consciousness enters the womb, there is something in the suttas about the conditions necessary for birth, and that's uh, a male and a female uh, having sex. The woman is in the correct time, and there's a Gandhava present. And the figure of a Gandhava, what that means is subject of so much debate. And perhaps it means spirit, um, and perhaps, whatever, even the word spirit is problematic in this conversation, but perhaps it means a rebirth to be. But no, there's not an exact moment when it's said that it happens, although there seems to be the indication that it could happen from conception. How might I know if a memory was a past life? Good question. I don't know. Most of these memories that children have appear when they're around 2, and they seem to fade after about 5 years old. I do know some meditators who, when their samadhi deepens, they're able to recollect past lives. Um, and as to the validity of those claims, I can't verify. And that's important to acknowledge here is like none of us really know, and the Buddha was clear about that in a sutta called Protecting Truth, where he said, when one has the belief in something, one says, I have the belief, but one does not come yet to the conclusion, only this is true, everything else is false. So none of us know for sure. Ajahn, I've been compelled by the story of the airplane, James, but this sounds like what I understood as reincarnation, a complete transfer, rather than karmic tendencies alone in rebirth. So what Dave, thank you, Dave, is I think referring to is often we make this distinction in Buddhism between rebirth and reincarnation. Reincarnation is the term that we often apply to the Vedic conception of rebirth, which is that an Atman or a self, a soul that is unchanging, moves from body to body. Whereas rebirth is more of this idea of a comic continuity moving from body to body, because in the Buddhist conception, anatta, anatman, we don't have the concept of a immortal, unchanging self, locus of identity. But what that looks like externally is very similar, because even rebirth happens in the sense of a comic continuity moving through time in the present life. You are the, comic continuity, the rebirth of your childhood self. It's the same body, but there's no distinction between that process of karma and continuity of habit pattern and karma carrying from you 40 years ago to you now, and what happens between a death and a birth. It's the same thing, just with probably a little more of a shift because the physical body goes. But yeah, what a rebirth will look like is exactly that. It'll look like the individual popping up with a bunch of memories, because that's all we are. It's karma in that sense. I mean, what we are or aren't is, anyways, whole nother question. But in terms of our habit patterns, personalities, and memories, those are all karmic things that carry, just as they've carried from yesterday morning to today. Ajahn, can you please speak about how past life memories can be retained across lifetimes without the existence of a self? So this may have been addressed just in the previous thing, but memories are karma. The sense of self is karma. And they would be maintained in the same way that you maintain memories of uh, something, um, in your childhood, except, and this perhaps is what you're getting at, is the substrate of physicality is no longer there, and so you couldn't map those onto um, a brain. And as to how that works, I have no idea. The Buddha did say there were imponderables that one should not investigate for fear that your head would explode. And one of those was the domain or abilities of a Buddha, the abilities of one with jhana, deep meditative calm, the workings of Kama, and I think the origin of the world. So I think it's worth pointing out how strange the world is already in our scientific conception. It made a lot of sense until about the 1900s. And if you've looked into the disintegration of Newtonian mechanics under the barrage of experimentally verified evidence from quantum, it's we live in a very strange world, and only part of it's comprehensible by the human mind. The ability for a light particle to be both a wave and a particle at the same time, as evidenced by the two-slit experiment, is it's mind-blowing. And so I think leaving room for, some of these things aren't explained, but quantum, in a sense, really isn't explained either. If conscious awareness, as taught by Longpo Sumedo, is not personal, how can something from a person's past life show up to be remembered or influence a person's future life? That's a good question. When Longpo Sumedo speaks about conscious awareness, I don't exactly know where to map that on to the Orthodox Buddhist doctrine. And this is something I think many of us kind of work with around those teachings is the Buddha taught using apophatic method, which is via negativa. He said, you're not this, you're not the personality, you're not the body. But as to what you come to when you let go of that, he called it nibbana. Um, I get the sense Longpo Sumedho is pointing to some experiential element which is less identified with the person. I feel uncomfortable equating that with a deathless element or something outside of conditionality because I just don't have experience with this. And um, yeah, and so I can't speak to that. But I would say that part of what that awareness knows is uh, karmic patterns. When you are step back into that place of awareness, you can see your habits, your memories, the physical patterning in your body. And those patterns are what would carry, I would imagine. But who knows? You say at one time you did not believe in rebirth, and now you do. And what is difficult to be a monastic without that belief? What led to your change in belief, and what made you believe? Thank you, Michelle. We are going to have to make this quick because we just reached the end of our time. But yeah, I've been practicing for about maybe 4 years at that point. I started when I was 15, and um, I think I just kept reading it in the suttas, and then there came a point where I was like, "Huh, if this was any other issue where so many people near to me had experiences which were kind of inexplicable by my view of science, I'd at least be open to it." And then I was a little more open to it, and a lot more people had stories than I thought. They just weren't sharing them with me because I'd never asked or it didn't seem like I'd believed them. But then what really brought it all home for me was reading Dr. Ian Stevenson's book and, well, books about him. There's many. Uh, and I found that to be pretty evidence that I found very convincing. So I hope everyone's well. It's great to see everyone. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you all soon enough, hopefully on Saturday. Take care.